Okay, shall we start?
Yeah, I think you're on.
Okay, very good. Well, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining and um, being a part of this, in some ways, an experimental class. So I think Chinese medicine is very interesting in the States and even in Taiwan. I think China as well. It's it's it it tends in these days to be a medicine that is people choose as a profession, not because they make a lot of money in it or because they have a high status in society or because their fathers did it or parents did it or something like that. That Western medicine seems to be more about that. Chinese medicine tends to be chosen by people who um, are curious or have had some sort of problem that they just couldn't seem to figure out how to take care of, or other people couldn't take care of it for them. And so, in many cases, out of desperation, they turn to uh, to a school and learn the system themselves, and just try to take charge of their own problems by learning Chinese medicine. And it's a very it's an interesting phenomenon, and many of the students that I've had and seen are just like us here in this class. Just start with a little curiosity. It's something that you hear about in the papers, or maybe you had a little experience with it, but there's this mystique surrounding it, and so um, and that's how I got started in it myself. It was something I was interested in, and had a curiosity about this mysterious medicine. Plus, I had my own aches and pains and things like that that just never seemed to get better, even with some appointments to top doctors. And when I had the opportunity, I started to play around a little bit. I found a teacher in Taiwan and got so hooked into it that it became my profession, for better or worse. So I'm not sure if any of you will be joining a acupuncture school, enrolling in an acupuncture school in a few months or not, but I'm very happy to help you kind of open the door and kind of see what's behind the uh, this this very ancient medicine. A couple things to start off with. Well, I guess one thing really just um, is some people have asked for book recommendations, and I'm going to put, let's see, four books in the chat, and let's see, where is that chat here? So the first book is The Web That Has No Weaver. That's a book that was written by Ted Kapchuk. It's actually, I'm not sure if I should say it was written by him, but I think translated would be maybe more close. It was written many decades ago, and it's still a classic. It's basically a translation of the uh, fundamentals, Chinese medicine fundamentals, that from the textbooks of mainland China. It's very straightforward, very simple, very well written, and if you want a text to follow while you go through this class, I recommend that book. It's when I was in college, one of my mentors handed it to me and said, "This might be of interest to you." And I read it through. I had no idea what it was talking about, but I read it through, and I later found it to be quite helpful looking back at it. So that would probably be the best if you want to have a written source. The other three, I am personally not familiar with. In setting up this course, I polled a Chinese medicine scholars Facebook group, which I'm a part of, and asked what recommendations they would have for a course like this. And of all the books that were recommended, these three seem to be, I think, fairly accessible and maybe of interest. So you're welcome to check those books out. I do not have them. I haven't read them. I will not be using them in my course. I generally derive my material from the Chinese sources, which I think the Web That Has No Weaver will be the closest to that. So if you have questions, it's probably easier for you to ask questions directly out of that book.
Daniel,
Yes.
when you say the fundamental writings that the Web Has No Weaver is a translation of the fundamentals, is that akin to the Chinese classics? Is it the Yellow Emperor's Guide?
Good question. So modern Chinese medicine, in coming out of the mainland Chinese system, is a textbook system. Chinese medicine was both by the Republican, the ROC, the nationalist government that Chiang Kai-shek was in charge of, the government that took over from the Qing dynasty in 1911. They wanted to modernize and tried to get rid of Chinese medicine. But there was a few people, Jim Menching was one of them, one of the 4 doctors that actually had enough influence and saved Chinese medicine. And, there was a turn of change of heart by the rulers. And so Chinese medicine was saved. Then China had the revolution with the Maoists, the communists winning the Civil War. If you know the politics, I'm sorry to repeat that, but the Chinese government that had been ruling, the Chiang Kai-shek ruled government, fled to Taiwan and some other countries and established a base there. So Taiwan actually, right now, is actually just a base where the government had a plan to, reinforce their army and then take back mainland China. So Taiwan and China still at war technically, but so Taiwan, the government that's on Taiwan, kept their Chinese medical system as a very traditional system. The Chairman Mao also, when he gained power, tried to dismantle Chinese medicine, because that, like everything else that he was getting rid of, was the old, and he wanted to bring in the new. He also had a change of heart. There's some stories about that. And he also realized that Chinese medicine might be the perfect tool for people in the rural countries to get medical care at a very cheap rate, with a system that could be put in place very simply and cheaply. And so he instituted, you probably heard, the barefoot doctors and so forth, things like that. So Chinese medicine was also nearly destroyed, but then saved in mainland China as well. What happened with the medicine in mainland China was that when Chairman Mao decided he was going to save Chinese medicine, he invited a committee of doctors to get together and establish a series of textbooks that would be used for the schools for learning Chinese medicine. And out of that committee came all the textbooks. The interesting thing about that committee was that none of them were Chinese doctors. They were all Western doctors, or MDs. They're all Chinese doctors of Western medicine. And they were the ones that decided what was useful and what was not. And the idea was, like everything else in communist China at the time was to make everything systematic, to make it scientific, you know, these code words. And so the textbooks that came out were and still are used and have a lot of usefulness, but they recontextualize Chinese medicine in some ways to fit the purpose of the communist messages and to take away any of the inconsistencies, or also, of course, so-called superstition ideas, things like qi and shun and jing and, you know, spirit and evil things and all that were smoothed out to make it more, you know, spirit became consciousness, for example. So it changed, it morphed, and that's the textbook tradition that has prevailed throughout mainland China and then throughout the rest of the world as it's spread out to Europe and the United States and so forth. So Ted Kaptchuk's book is a translation and an adaptation of a fundamental textbook. So mainland China has that system. Taiwan, where I learned, never went through that textbook system. It's still, everything is by the classics. Nevertheless, what's nice about the fundamental textbooks is that it does create a nice, easy system to kind of, you know, a stepping stone into Chinese medicine. And if you are interested and have the capacity and time and all that, then, you know, you definitely need to go back into the classics. Okay, any other questions?
Just a reminder that everybody needs to mute themselves.
Thank you. So what I propose to do in this class is talk about, today I would like to introduce Chinese medicine, maybe a little bit of a repeat from some of the presentations I made before, but I hopefully do it a little bit more completely. And in the coming weeks, I'm going to talk about all the basic principles that Chinese medicine uses. For example, what is qi? What is jing? What is shun? You know, what is yin and yang? These things are very well defined in the Chinese medicine's world. They leave the mystical realm and go into a very practical, they have very practical definitions within Chinese medicine. I almost sounded like Dizzy Gillespie there. So, and then after we cover that set of basics, then I'm going to take you through each of the organs and the channels that the organs are associated with and give you the pathway that they follow, some of the major acupuncture points. I'm happy, it'd be really fun to teach you some of the locations that, you know, maybe you can use them for yourself or your friends. And, but they also teach a little bit about how those channels work and what they're useful for internally. And that alone, there's 12 major channels. So that each channel, if we do one channel a week or one channel for 2 weeks, we're talking 3-4 months with that. So that itself is the what I propose to be the main content of this class. And then going forward, if people are interested, then we can go back and talk about the pathology of that. But that would be maybe a continuation if people want to. That's kind of going back and going through all the organs again and saying what might go wrong. And that's more of a clinical matter, but still quite interesting. So that's the outline of the course. And I'm happy to get started if unless there's any questions. And please feel free to jump in if you have a question, either by chat or just unmute yourself and ask. I'm very happy to make this more of a conversational class than a lecture class. It's 7 in the morning here, so it's much better if my speech gets broken up by your speech. Okay, since nobody's going to save me. And we can get started. So one of the beautiful qualities about Chinese medicine, even with both the Republic of Chinese, the nationalist government by Chiang Kai-shek and the Maoist government, even with their attempts to destroy Chinese medicine, it didn't get destroyed, and it continues and is thriving today. It's I would say it's the only ancient Chinese medical system that is unbroken in its tradition for 2,000 years, even longer, of course, but I'll talk about why I peg it at 2,000 years. That we can take today, we can go to the library and go online now and access texts that were written even more than 2,000 years ago, but especially around in the mid to late Han Dynasty, which is from the year 0 to the year, well, Han Dynasty was about 200 BCE to 200 CE. The Chinese medical texts were really consolidated around that time period, around the 1st century CE, which is, that's why I peg this tradition to be in a formal medical system to be around 2,000 years old. We can access any of those texts, or most of those texts, and most of all the texts that were written after that, and there's many, and open them up and study them. And not just study the text, but study multitudes of commentaries about them. And also have hundreds of living physicians and scholars who also study them and have continued to study them unbroken for 2,000 years, and have access to what they think it mean, what those people think that a certain passage might mean intellectually, academically, and especially clinically. So there was no colonialism that destroyed the tradition. There was no Roman Catholic Church, for example, that had a huge influence to change and break the tradition of European medicine that came out of Galen. Chinese had no such interference. There was no religious or political interference with Chinese medicine up until this, the 1900s. So it's an incredible system. Now, one, because it is fairly unbroken. The second, because the Chinese love to write things down. Everything is written down. And then not just written down, but the Chinese love, classically, historically, I'm not talking about every Chinese person, but historically as a culture, they love to catalog. And so every century or every so often you get somebody or some emperor who commissions cataloging. And this is in the Taoist text, this is in the Buddhist text, the Confucian text, Chinese medicine text, I'm sure the calligraphy text, everything gets cataloged. Every few emperors, somebody says catalog stuff. And you'll have somebody or some committee collect all the extant texts that are available and put them in a new catalog. And so we have so much of these texts available to us that if you go to, say, Ayurvedic tradition, I don't have any experience with the living Ayurvedic tradition, but that's a very somewhat equivalent system in the sense of how ancient it is, and I'm sure it's a very thorough system. But because of the British rule, for one, and because of the Indian philosophical traditions tend to be and still are an oral transmission. People will sit, young children will sit at the feet of their guru and memorize texts, incredible memorization. This, for texts that have been transmitted this way for 2,000-3,000 years. And so the problem that you have with a system like that, and this is true with all native, many native systems, is that it gets transmitted orally from, shaman to disciple or whatever, is that can be broken very quickly. And that's the first thing. Like in one generation, that can be destroyed and has been destroyed in many traditions throughout the world, as we all know. The second thing is I can know every single word if my memorization capacity is perfect, which it's really amazing in the Indian system. I can memorize everything my teacher has to say and play it back in my mind word for word. However, I have no idea what the guy next to me is talking about. Like the doctor down the street, what is he talking about? I have no idea. So again, just to reiterate, the Chinese medical system, you can learn what your teacher has to say. Of course, you need it to be have an apprenticeship of some sort or some sort of training to interpret the classics in a clinical fashion. But you can also learn your books are also your teacher as well. You can learn all these different systems that have been brought out in times of war, in times of peace, in times of famine, in times of wealth, in times of plague like we have this year, in times of people who are just happy and eating and getting fat and what problems they have, rich people, poor people, people in the mountains versus people in the desert or people on the sea, people in the south, people in the north. All of these types of people in all these different times will have different diseases and different medical conditions that they have to deal with. And so when you have a doctor that even one every 100 years who is good enough and smart enough and motivated enough to write down his experiences, mostly his, very little hers, I'm sorry about that, they will, then you have, then for me or for any of us, we have access to all of that different information. So when I learned Chinese medicine, I learned it with my teacher in Taiwan, a very subtropical, hot and humid country, kind of a 2-season country. It's either hot and humid or it's cold and rainy for 2 months. Just that's it, one or the other. And so you have certain endemic situations that you see over and over again in that place. And so from there, when I moved to Seattle, which is a very northern country, temperate, rainy. It's been raining here for 2 weeks straight. People eat food in a certain way, and a different lifestyle situation. People now are into keto diet, for example, or the paleo diet, and so all of a sudden these things change how people present in the clinic. If I were to use everything my teacher said and everything I was used to in Taiwan into Seattle, I would fail. In fact, I did. When I first moved here, I brought the things that I knew and secondhand, formulas that I could just throw out of my back pocket and slam on the table in Taiwan, and I would predict that they would work fairly well. They failed miserably here. Not all of them, but many. And so I had to reach back into all the classics that I had been exposed to and redesign my healing methods to work for Seattle. So that's the beauty of Chinese medicine. and it's why it's thrived in modern day, because it works so well.
Danielle,
Yes.
when you say you had to revise your formulas, is that just herbal, or is that the combination of herbal and acupunctural and, I don't know, movement advice, qigong, anything like that? Thanks.
Mostly on the herbal side. The acupuncture, to some extent, needs to change, but less so. And I can talk about that when we move into the channels and how acupuncture can work for you. Herbs tend to be much more specific. You know, just like in the supermarket, in the summertime, you might choose a watermelon, and in the wintertime, you might choose a different type of fruit, right? Just because of the seasonality and what seems to be more comfortable at any given time. And just the same thing with Chinese medicine. In this climate, people get coughs and very phlegmy and hard to get rid of. So there's actually a name for it called the Seattle crud. And you get sick in the fall, and congestion builds up, and then you see people that are still coughing with the same. They're not sick in terms of infected anymore, but they can't get rid of that congestion in their lungs. Even in February or March, they're still dealing with that, and then they'll come to see you. You don't see that in Taiwan and other places. When I use formulas that I would use to clear out that phlegm that were very effective in Taiwan, and I used them here, it actually made it worse. I was embarrassed, here I am, this studied in Taiwan guy, and my patients are telling me that I'm making them worse. That also was the case with skin diseases as well. Skin rashes, eczema, reacted very differently to the same formulas that worked very well in Taiwan and worked horribly here. So I have many embarrassing stories, especially my first year or two here. So I had to figure out what did work.
Daniel, you always got the herbs from Taiwan though, or where would you get the herbs in Seattle?
So the herbs that are the loose herbs, the roots and barks that you put in a pot and boil, those almost exclusively come out of mainland China. Even in Taiwan, they source that from mainland China. If you've ever had the powdered herbs, kind of granulated herbs, those are Taiwanese made products. And they take the herbs from China, and the good companies have a very good sourcing process where they, test for heavy metals and pesticides and stuff. And then they have certain factories where they boil those herbs in a certain way and then granulate them. So those products I use a lot, and I get those from Taiwanese. Those are Taiwanese companies. The raw herbs you get from mainland China. For me, my pharmacy is very limited, and although there are many companies in the U.S. right now that distribute those herbs, so I don't need to get them from China or Taiwan, except a few that I can't buy here. So I'll order them from my friends in Taiwan. So yes, thank you. Okay. Any other questions?
Daniel, what's the difference between the 12 channels and the 8 extraordinary channels?
That's a great question. I'll talk more about that in a few weeks when we talk about the organs and the channels. There are 12 main organs in the body, and each of them has a channel that's associated with it, kind of a conduit. These extraordinary channels, and I actually, that translation I don't like. The Chinese does not mean extraordinary. They just mean actually more like odd. These misfit channels. They're described to be like reservoirs. You know, if a lake fills up, you have like a marsh or a side channel which can take the overflow, and that's what those extraordinary channels are described in a text 2,000 years ago. That's how they were described. So they're kind of overflow channels
And
in a certain way.
could I ask, I've heard it said that the 12 different channels or meridians are really actually all one, but that they have different, you know, like a river of different sections. What's your thought on that?
I've never heard that before, so I'm not sure what they're talking about, but they are connected and they form one, just like your cardiovascular system, they form one network, but
Right.
they're all
System,
distinct.
different times of day, different things are deeper
Yeah.
or whatever, but that one flows into the other. And so it can
Yes.
be as a unit.
Yes. I'll talk all about that for sure. That's on the agenda. That's what we'll do maybe in a week or two when we get to that part, for sure.
Daniel, when
That'll be the core of this class.
Daniel, I've got a question. Oh, I'm sorry. Just about what you said, the systemization in the 50s, or I guess 50s, 60s, and how that differed some from Chinese medicine earlier. I know someone who does this kind of in a Qigong context, the kind of medical stuff, who told me that when people use the term traditional Chinese medicine or TCM, they're really talking about that latter day systemization. And I was wondering if that's pretty much true, and if so whether you know that's changing some. If people are now looking back more towards to what was before, as you know, the last 60 years or so.
That is absolutely true. TCM, the abbreviations for traditional Chinese medicine, is almost like a trademark name for communist textbook Chinese medicine. So TCM stands for traditional Chinese medicine. I like to say it's textbook Chinese medicine. That's true. So in Taiwan is not TCM. It's nobody even really knows what that is there. It's just Chinese medicine. So yes, the terminology is very important in a certain way. But of course, nobody really understands that. Even students that go through the schools here, they don't even know. So practitioners will just say TCM and things like that, and they don't even know the difference.
This is Barbara. I could also point out that there's a parallel with Tai Chi in terms of the communist government did the same thing in the Tai Chi world by taking the family lineages and standardizing them as an amalgamated style, which we know as the what do they call it? You know, there's the
Like the simplified 24s and stuff like that.
Yeah, and so that was the same. It's part of a tendency of the mainland government to get things out of family lineage, because that was part of the old world, and it was not controllable by the political arms. So all of these are really fascinating arenas of how any kind of discipline reflects the society it's coming from. And you can look at, you know, in America, for instance, the medical systems are the same, you know, that they respond to the historical circumstances and social circumstances.
Great. And Natasha, you had a question.
Yes, thank you. Daniel, I was just wondering, when you do the channels, whether you're going to go also into the thing that, you know, when you study the TCM, they don't talk about it much. The what's it called? It's such a long time since I've done this. The inner pathways,
I will definitely do inner path.
like the musculature and, you know, those other things that are not the channels that they relate to.
I'll introduce them, but we won't talk about them one by one because
Okay. I know it's a lot to do.
Well, no, because it's even professional Chinese medical doctors don't necessarily study them so much, for better or worse, because they don't have as much practical use, living practical use in the clinic. So, and there's not very much information about them in the classics, actually, very little.
Oh, I know that was why I was hoping that maybe you might, you know, having done the traditional, not the TCM, but the real traditional.
No, even in the classics, there's very little. In fact, the modern textbooks have tried to make it more than it was in the past. And so you get a lot of information, but just because they want everything to be clear and connected, not because it's actually true.
Okay.
It's like, yeah.
That's great. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, Patrick.
I'm understanding all the factors involved, lifestyle, culture, environment, the way people eat, you know, exercise, just weather, climate. Has age ever been categorized? You know, the developmental baby to adult to senior? Did that ever get categorized?
Yeah, very much so. That's in the very early chapters of the Neijing, the Yellow Emperor's Classic, which is kind of put on a pedestal as the Bible of Chinese medicine. Not really written by any one person, but a compilation of many texts that was around the 1st century CE, and then added on later over the centuries, a few chapters here and there. But that's in that text, it talks very clearly about the maturation, the birth and maturation of people. I'd hate to quote that from you without having it in front of me, but they use a number system, and men and women are actually slightly different. So they go, you know, 6, 6, 12, 12, 18, 18, or no, I'm sorry, the 6, 6, 6, 1, 6, 2, 6, 3. So 6, 12, 18. My math is horrible right now, and so forth. And then in sevens for the other gender, 7, 14, and you know, so around the 14, 15 age, they talk about the puberty, and then in the 20s and 30s, they talk about the kind of, I don't want to say virility, but the robustness of the person, and then the aging, and then finally the decrepit era, right? And so that comes out of a question by the Yellow Emperor. That whole text is question and answer. The Yellow Emperor, who's the legendary emperor of China, this 5,000 years ago. We don't really know anything about this person except through legends and books that were written thousands of years after he supposedly lived. But anyway, the Yellow Emperor's Classic is the Yellow Emperor and his physician hanging out and talking with each other, basically in different situations. And the Yellow Emperor asks the question is, how come people would live to 100 years in the past? So this is 5,000 years ago, and he's talking about the past, the golden age of his past, saying, why could people in the past live to 100 years old and still be very, you know, robust, whereas now people at 50 are already, you know, decrepit and bent over and you know, can't even make it to 100. And so that then the doctor describes what's wrong with people nowadays. And the answer is lifestyle. You know, people, I can quote this almost exactly. People don't wake up and go to sleep at the right times. People don't eat the right foods with correct regularity. People enter the bedchamber drunk, if you know what I mean. That's actually the exact words. And basically that's it. And because of this poor lifestyle choices, they get weak and old prematurely. So, and that's not a Taoist concept, actually. That's actually, you can see the Confucians in that time period, or just slightly before that time period, also saying exactly the same thing. So the ritual within the daily lifestyle, the daily life, is what is keeps us healthy and helps us live long. It's not even a Taoist thing of you know, what bark or what seed from what tree to eat and what kind of qigong to do. Nothing like that.
Daniel,
Yes.
Inoshi is asking in the chat, it seems that you are saying that endemics and constitution of each individual are quite significant.
Yes. Yeah, thank you for that question. In Chinese medicine is about the individual and the context around that individual. So in a Chinese medicine, I can have 5 people come to me with very similar symptoms, or maybe the same disease name. You know, the doctor writes down the same disease, but when they come to me, I have to give them different. Or if I gave everybody the same herbal treatment, maybe 2 of them will get better, 3 of them won't. And so that's absolutely important to, in Chinese medicine especially, to be looking at the individual and not the disease itself.
But Daniel, according to the age, like you said, 7, 14, 21, do you adjust the herbal quantity like we do in Western medicine, like dosage?
Yes, but not according to that timeline. That's more of a structured timeline that was you know, textual and had a numerological significance of, you know, yin and yang numbers for men and women. That's more just practical based on doctors' experience, and different doctors will do it differently. You know, by weight even. You know, if you have an adult that's very, very small and petite, you might give a lighter dose as well. So pediatrics to geriatrics, you can use very similar herbs, except you know, some populations, like young kids, do very well when you focus on their digestive system, and then teenagers do very well when you focus on something else, just by the nature of their metabolism and nature of lifestyle.
Daniel?
Yes.
I just want to reemphasize to everyone that, and correct me if I'm wrong, that it is your preference that people just jump in with questions whenever they're ready, and they can unmute themselves to do that. Is that correct?
Yes, I would like this class to be a class for you people, for all of you. So I have a structure that I will go through, but I also want to make sure I answer everybody's questions, because this is what this class should be about, is answering your questions and teaching, and also answering questions. There's a lot of, you know, all kinds of information swirling around about Chinese medicine. So I'd love this to be a very relaxed class that also has a forward motion at the same time. So,
Great. And can I also, Jia Ling is asking in the chat, is saying that the web that has no weaver has that original 1980s version and then the updated 2000 edition. Do you have an edition you prefer?
I don't think it's going to make a huge difference. I actually don't know what the new edition has. I have a feeling that there's not much change in it at all, actually. I don't think there's much new content. So if you have a cheaper, if there's a cheaper version, then do that. If anybody here reads Chinese, by the way, I would recommend just going directly into the Chinese, because the English translation, even an amazing translator, the words are very different than how they are in Chinese. It's just a different feel and a different meaning. There's a lot of words that have become in popular use in English now that are actually quite misleading and wrong. For example, the word meridians. It's a wrong word. It doesn't mean the channels. Channels are much more accurate than meridians. We can talk about that next week or the week after. But if you can read Chinese, or you have aspiration to read Chinese, let me know, and maybe we can get a textbook or some pages for that. I do want to be mindful of the time. We have the global session coming up in 10 minutes or so. I'd like to leave this class around 45 minutes from at least my time zone, to 7 to 7:45. I'm happy to answer a few questions, but maybe I'll finish off by just explaining that Chinese medicine, just to summarize, Chinese medicine is a comprehensive system that includes everything, including emergency medicine and chronic medicine. It includes, in its proper context, legally and social contexts, where people are expecting it to be a medicine. You go to a Chinese doctor and they might do acupuncture, they might give you herbs, they might do chiropractic work, massage. They have herbs for the inside, where you swallow them. They have herbs for the skin that you put on patches. They do scraping and cupping and even psychotherapy to some extent, bone setting, trauma care, animal bites, wounds, trauma, lacerations, whatever. They're a full service clinic, traditionally, for sure. And in the modern day, everything has become, jostling around with who has more political power. Modern conventional medicine, that's kind of dictated by AMA, or in the States, we have chiropractors and naturopaths and all kinds of people that vie for political power and scope of practice. But Chinese medicine, in its pure form, has everything that you would ever need to treat anybody coming in with anything. And so when you explore Chinese medicine, it's got everything. And we can finish this up next, continue next week for sure. So thank you, everybody. I really appreciate and happy you're all here.
Thank you, Daniel.
You.